The cold steel snapped around Dr. Maya Daniels's wrists, the sound sharp and final amidst the airport's chaotic symphony. In that moment, she wasn't the decorated director of the very security apparatus arresting her. She was just another statistic, another black woman in a hoodie deemed suspicious. The two officers, confident in their judgment, had no idea they were handcuffing their own boss. They didn't know their worlds were about to be turned upside down by the very woman they were detaining. But as the cameras flashed and the crowd murmured, one question hung in the air. Would this moment of profound injustice become a catalyst for change, or just another forgotten headline? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. A few hours earlier, the world had been a different kind of blur. Maya had arrived on a red-eye from a security conference in Seattle, a cross-country flight that had left a bone-deep weariness in its wake. The lingering scent of stale, recycled airplane air clung to her simple gray hoodie and sweatpants, a uniform of anonymity she often preferred for travel. Her mind, however, was anything but weary. It was a finely tuned instrument, sharp and analytical, constantly processing the environment around her. She had foregone the discreet VIP exit, a privilege of her position she rarely used. Instead, she chose to walk with the river of humanity flowing into the public arrivals area of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. She was here to conduct one of her infamous unannounced spot checks, a practice that kept her grounded and her teams on their toes. The airport at dawn was a world unto itself, a creature stirring from a brief, restless slumber. The low, rhythmic hum of industrial floor polishers echoed through the cavernous halls, their operators moving like solitary dancers on a vast, gleaming stage. The rich, invigorating aroma of brewing coffee and baking cinnamon began to snake its way from the concessions, a fragrant promise against the morning chill. The first wave of travelers, a motley crew of business suits and vacationing families, moved with a palpable anxiety, their faces etched with the stress of departure times and security lines. Maya found her vantage point easily, a thick concrete pillar near the main security checkpoint that offered a degree of cover without complete concealment. From here, she could observe her domain. Her gaze, sharp and discerning, swept over everything. She watched the TSA agents, noting their posture, their level of engagement, the subtle shifts in their tone as they interacted with an endless variety of passengers. She analyzed the flow of the lines, identifying bottlenecks and inefficiencies with a practiced eye. She absorbed the subtle body language of everyone involved, from the nervous first-time flyer fumbling with their documents to the seasoned road warrior who moved with an air of bored resignation. This was her world, a complex ecosystem of movement, technology, and human behavior, and she was its unseen guardian, its most critical observer. On the other side of the concourse, Officer John O'Malley was starting his patrol, a ritual he'd performed for 25 years. The ambition he'd once had was long gone, eroded by decades of dealing with the public and replaced by a thick callus of cynicism. He operated on a kind of cynical autopilot, his eyes scanning the crowds not for people who needed help, but for problems waiting to happen. His partner, Ben Peterson, was his opposite in almost every way. Young, ambitious, and with less than 3 years on the force, Peterson saw every patrol as an opportunity. He was eager to prove himself, to show the veteran O'Malley that he had what it took, which in his mind meant mirroring the older officer's hardened, world-weary demeanor. They were a mismatched pair, the jaded veteran and the eager apprentice, moving through the growing throngs of travelers. O'Malley noticed Maya first. It was a flicker of something that didn't fit his internal, unwritten rulebook of airport behavior. He nudged Peterson with his elbow, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes. "See that one over there?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "By the pillar. Been there 10 minutes. Hasn't moved. Just watching." Peterson's gaze followed, his eyes narrowing as he tried to see what his partner saw. He took in the gray hoodie, the way the woman's hands were tucked into her pockets, her stillness amidst the constant motion. Hoodie up, hands in her pockets, Peterson responded, his tone mimicking O'Malley's suspicion. "Looks sketchy." Their brief exchange was a masterclass in confirmation bias. In their minds, her casual attire, her race, and her quiet observation coalesced into a narrative of suspicion. They didn't see a tired traveler or a patient person waiting for a friend. They saw a potential threat, a nail sticking up that needed to be hammered down. It was, in their view, routine, proactive policing, a way to stop trouble before it started. The decision was made without another word. They changed their course, their strides becoming more purposeful as they began to move toward the pillar. The officer's approach was a study in subtle aggression. Their posture was immediately confrontational, their shoulders squared, their presence intended to intimidate. O'Malley, as the senior officer, took the lead, his face set in a mask of bored authority. He stopped a few feet from Maya, deliberately invading her personal space. "Ma'am," he began, his voice carrying a tone of practiced condescension, "you need to either get in line or move along. You can't loiter here." Maya turned her head slowly, her expression calm, her mind still in analytical mode. She was no longer just observing the checkpoint, she was now observing the observers. "I'm just observing, officers," she said, her voice even and steady. "Is there a problem?" Her profound calmness seemed to act as an irritant, a variable they hadn't expected. It didn't fit their script. A guilty person would be flustered, a compliant one apologetic. Her placid demeanor felt like a challenge. Peterson stepped forward, eager to assert his own authority. "The problem is your behavior," he said, his voice sharper than O'Malley's. "It's suspicious. We need to see some ID." Maya met his gaze for a moment before reaching into her pocket and retrieving her wallet. She handed over her driver's license. O'Malley took it, his eyes glancing at it for a fraction of a second before dismissing it. "Dr. Maya Daniels," he read aloud, the title Doctor dripping with a faint, unmistakable sarcasm. "Okay, Dr. what are you observing?" Here it was, the critical juncture. Maya knew she could end this entire charade with a single sentence, a flash of her official credentials, but a deeper, more pressing curiosity took hold. This was a perfect, unscheduled test of the very system she was responsible for. How would her officers, her procedures, and her training hold up under real-world conditions when confronted with their own biases? She decided to let the test run its course. "The efficiency of your security checkpoint," she answered, the statement both entirely truthful and, in this context, dangerously provocative. The officers exchanged a look. To them, her answer was not the truth, it was insolence. It was a smart remark from someone who thought they were better than everyone else. The situation, already tense, began to escalate rapidly. "You're interfering with security operations, ma'am," O'Malley said, his voice hardening. "Your presence is making other passengers nervous." It was a fabrication, a justification created out of thin air to validate their next step. Maya remained silent, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to their growing agitation. This was the final straw for them. Her refusal to be intimidated was, in their eyes, the ultimate confirmation of her guilt. "That's it," O'Malley declared, his patience, real or feigned, completely gone. "For the safety of the other passengers, we're detaining you." Maya felt a cold, sinking feeling of profound disappointment wash over her. She saw years of her own work, countless hours spent developing training modules on de-escalation and implicit bias, evaporating in the face of ingrained prejudice. The rough, textured fabric of O'Malley's glove closed around her upper arm, a sudden, unwelcome intimacy that sent a shiver down her spine. Peterson moved behind her to conduct a pat-down, his hands moving over her body with a detached professionalism that felt deeply personal and humiliating. Then came the handcuffs. The metallic click echoed in the cavernous space, a sound of finality that drew the attention of hundreds of people. A sea of phones rose around her, their lenses like 1,000 unblinking eyes. The flashes of their cameras felt like tiny, silent explosions in her peripheral vision, each one capturing a moment of public degradation that she knew, with a grim certainty, was already being uploaded, shared, and judged by a world that couldn't possibly understand the irony of the scene unfolding before them. The officers' confidence was absolute, their actions driven by a certainty that was about to be shattered into a million pieces. The frantic crackle of a radio cut through the mundane hum of the operations center, a sound that always put David Chen on edge. He was the airport's on-duty operations supervisor, a man who thrived on order and whose job was to wrestle chaos into submission. The voice on the other end was tinny and strained. "Dispatch to Supervisor Chen. We have a 10 to 53 at Checkpoint Charlie. Public disturbance. 2 officers on scene with a non-compliant female subject. A 10 to 53. A public disturbance." It was the bread and butter of airport life, the kind of call that usually meant a passenger had too much to drink before their flight or was having a meltdown over a missed connection. Chen grabbed his radio, his mind already cycling through the standard procedures. "Chen copies. En route," he responded, his voice the epitome of professional calm. He pushed back from his desk, the half-eaten bagel and lukewarm coffee forgotten. As he strode through the secure corridors, his mind was a checklist of possibilities. Drunk and disorderly, a domestic dispute spilling into public view, a passenger with a phobia of flying finally losing their nerve. He jogged the last 100 yards, his polished black shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum. He expected to see shouting, maybe some flailing limbs, the usual messy drama of human lives, intersecting inconveniently in a high-stress environment. What he saw stopped him cold. There was a crowd. Yes, a thick ring of travelers held back by the sheer gravity of the scene, their phones held up like votive candles at a somber vigil. And there were the two officers, O'Malley and Peterson, standing with a look of smug, self-satisfied control on their faces. They looked like men who had successfully neutralized a threat, who had done their job and were proud of it. And between them, standing with a preternatural quietness that was more unsettling than any shouting could ever be, was a handcuffed black woman in a simple grey hoodie. Chen's professional haste evaporated, replaced by a creeping sense of unease. Something was wrong. The woman wasn't resisting. She wasn't crying or yelling. She was just still. Her posture was one of quiet dignity, a stark, unnerving contrast to the cold steel locked around her wrists. He pushed through the edge of the crowd, his eyes narrowing, trying to get a clearer look at the non-compliant female. The murmur of the onlookers faded into a dull roar in his ears as he got closer. His gaze landed on the woman's face, taking in her high cheekbones, the intelligent, analytical set of her eyes, the calm, composed line of her mouth. And then, recognition hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't a slow dawning, but a sudden, violent crash of understanding. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. His forward momentum ceased so abruptly that he almost stumbled. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, and a wave of ice-cold dread washed over him, so potent it made his stomach clench. He let out a small, strangled sound, an audible gasp that was lost in the general din for everyone except the three people at the center of the storm. Director Daniels? The name hung in the air, thick with disbelief and a horror so profound it was almost comical. O'Malley and Peterson, who had been basking in the perceived authority of the moment, turned to look at him. Their expressions of smug confidence began to curdle, replaced by a slow, creeping confusion. O'Malley, ever the senior officer, spoke first, his voice still laced with the arrogance of a man who believes he is in the right. "Sir, you know this woman?" he asked, gesturing with his chin toward Maya. She was acting suspiciously, refusing to cooperate, loitering near a sterile area. Chen didn't even hear him. His eyes were locked on Maya, his mind screaming, a silent siren of pure, unadulterated panic. This was Dr. Maya Daniels, not just a director, but the Times director. The woman whose portrait hung in the main administrative building. The woman who had personally led the security overhaul of the entire southeastern region. The woman who could end his career, and the careers of these two oblivious officers, with a single, softly spoken word. His voice, when he finally found it, was a trembling, reedy thing he barely recognized as his own. "Director," he stammered, his gaze flicking from her calm face to the brutal metal cuffs on her wrists and back again. "Director, I am so sorry. What happened? Are you all right?" The word director echoed in the space between the two officers, a semantic bomb that detonated in the quiet confines of their minds. For Ben Peterson, the effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The color drained from his face, leaving it as white as a sheet of paper. His bravado, the carefully constructed facade of a hardened cop he had been trying to project, crumbled into dust. His mind became a whirlwind of pure panic, a chaotic vortex of flashing lights and screaming sirens. Asterisk director. Director of what? Oh God, no. Not the director. It can't be. She's in a hoodie. She was suspicious. Asterisk. He felt a wave of nausea so intense he thought he might be sick right there on the polished concourse floor. His entire career, the ambition that had driven him, the future he had so carefully planned, was flashing before his eyes, and it was all burning to the ground. He had handcuffed the director of the Transportation Security Administration. He had put his hands on the woman who literally wrote the rules he was supposed to enforce. O'Malley's reaction was slower, his mind buffered by 25 years of cynicism and denial. His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek as his brain scrambled to process the new, impossible information. He looked from the terrified, trembling supervisor to the calm, composed woman in handcuffs, and his mind refused to connect the dots. Asterisk. Director? Asterisk. It had to be a mistake. Maybe she was the director of some minor department, catering or janitorial services, something that would explain the supervisor's panic, but not upend his entire universe. He clung to this thought, a drowning man grasping at a piece of driftwood in a hurricane. But then he looked, really looked, at Maya Daniels. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the unyielding steel in her spine, the absolute lack of fear in her demeanor. And he saw the way Chen was looking at her, with a terror that bordered on religious reverence. The flimsy wall of his denial began to crack, and through the fissures, a terrifying reality began to seep in. He had not just made a mistake. He had committed a professional sin of such magnitude that he couldn't even begin to comprehend the consequences. The certainty that had guided his actions for his entire career, the simple, black-and-white conviction that he was one of the good guys, was shattering like glass. Then Maya spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the tension with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. It was still calm, still even, but it was now infused with an undeniable, unshakable authority that commanded the absolute attention of everyone present. She didn't need to raise her voice. The power in it was implicit, absolute. She addressed the still trembling supervisor, her eyes never leaving the faces of the two officers who had arrested her. "David," she said, the use of his first name, both a reassurance and a command. "Please instruct your officers to remove these restraints. Now." Galvanized by the direct order, Chen spun on the two officers, his panic momentarily replaced by a surge of adrenaline. "You heard her," he barked, his voice cracking with the strain. "Get those cuffs off her. Now! Move!" Peterson, his hands shaking so badly he looked like he was suffering from a palsy, fumbled for the key on his belt. His fingers felt like clumsy, useless sausages. He couldn't seem to make them work. The simple act of inserting a key into a lock, an action he had performed hundreds of times, suddenly felt as complex as brain surgery. O'Malley stood frozen for a second longer, his mind still reeling, before his own training kicked in and he reached to help his fumbling partner. The click of the handcuffs opening was deafeningly loud in the sudden, profound quiet that had fallen over the scene. The crowd, sensing the dramatic shift in power, had gone completely silent, their phones still recording, now capturing a very different kind of drama. Maya brought her hands in front of her, rubbing her wrists. It wasn't a gesture of pain, though the metal had left angry red marks on her skin. It was a deliberate, thoughtful motion, a quiet reclaiming of her autonomy. She took a slow, deep breath, and then she looked at the two officers. She looked directly at O'Malley, whose face was a mask of grim, dawning horror, and then at Peterson, who couldn't meet her gaze, his eyes fixed on the floor in a rictus of pure, unadulterated fear. Their bravado was gone, evaporated as if it had never existed. In its place was a silent, primal terror that was far more satisfying to her than any apology could ever be. "This is not the venue for this discussion," she said, her voice low and controlled, each word landing with the weight of a hammer blow. "My office, tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. sharp." She paused, letting the words sink in, letting them understand that this was not over, that this was just the beginning. "Do not be late." She then turned her attention to the supervisor, her tone shifting from that of a judge to that of a commander. "David," she said, her voice crisp and efficient, "I want copies of all incident reports and every second of bystander and security footage you can find. Have them on my desk within the hour." Without another word, she turned and walked away, her back straight, her stride purposeful, leaving behind a tableau of shattered confidence and a silence so complete it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. The drive home was a silent, suffocating affair. Officer John O'Malley gripped the worn steering wheel of his decade-old sedan, his knuckles white. The familiar comfort of the cracked leather and the faint scent of stale coffee did nothing to soothe the tremor in his hands. He usually had the talk radio on, a constant stream of angry voices that validated his own grim view of the world. But tonight, the silence was a roaring accusation. He kept replaying the event in the concourse, the sequence of events that had led to this catastrophic moment. His justifications, the ones that had felt so solid and righteous just hours ago, now sounded hollow and pathetic even inside his own head. Asterisk. She was suspicious. Asterisk. Why? Because she was standing still? Because of her hoodie? Asterisk. I was just doing my job. Asterisk. Was he? Or was he just acting on a lazy, ingrained prejudice that he had mistaken for instinct for years? The questions circled like vultures, picking apart the carcass of his professional pride. He thought about his pension, the finish line he was so close to crossing after a quarter-century of service. It was the bedrock of his future, the reward for a career he'd believed was honorable. Now, he saw it cracking, threatening to crumble into dust because of a 10-minute interaction. He was a man who saw the world in black and white, good guys and bad guys, rules and rule breakers. For the first time in his life, he was confronted with a universe of gray so vast and complex he couldn't begin to navigate it. He had arrested the director. The sheer, monumental stupidity of it was a physical weight in his chest. He pulled into the driveway of his modest suburban home, the house he'd lived in for 2 decades. Inside, the lights were on. Carol was waiting up. He walked through the door and she looked up from the television, her expression a mixture of concern and weary familiarity. "John, you're late. Everything okay?" He didn't know how to answer. He dropped his keys into the ceramic bowl by the door, the clatter sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet house. He tried to build his defense, to frame the story in a way that would make him the victim, or at least the justified authority figure. "Had an incident at work," he mumbled, loosening his tie. "Some woman, real uppity type, looking for trouble. Had to detain her." The words, meant to sound confident and dismissive, came out weak and lacking conviction. Carol muted the television, her gaze sharpening. She had been married to him for 30 years. She had heard countless stories like this, stories that always seemed to involve people who didn't look like them, people he described with a certain tone of voice. "Looking for trouble?" she repeated, her voice quiet but firm. "Or was she just not acting the way you thought she should?" His defensiveness flared, a thin, brittle shield for the raw fear underneath. "She was loitering, Carol, dressed like a thug. What was I supposed to think?" Carol sighed, a long, slow exhalation of disappointment that hit him harder than any official reprimand ever could. "You were supposed to think she was a person, John. Just a person. You see a black woman in a hoodie and you see a thug. I see our neighbor's daughter coming home from college. When did you get so hard?" He had no answer. He stood there in the foyer of his own home, a stranger to his wife, and for the first time, a stranger to himself. Her disappointment was a mirror, and in it, he saw not a veteran cop, but a tired, scared old man whose biases had finally, spectacularly, caught up with him. Meanwhile, in a small, tidy apartment across town, Ben Peterson was drowning in the cold, sterile glow of his laptop screen. He wasn't just scared, he was intellectually and professionally mortified. His hands trembled as he typed Dr. Maya Daniels into the search bar, his heart pounding a frantic, syncopated rhythm against his ribs. The search results flooded the screen, and each link was another nail in the coffin of his career. He wasn't just Googling a name, he was excavating the ruins of his own ambition. The first link was to her official TSA biography. Asterisk, Director of Security Operations, Southeastern Region. Asterisk. The title alone made him feel sick. He clicked, and the page loaded with a professional headshot. It was her, the same calm, intelligent face, but here she was in a sharp, tailored suit, an American flag pinned to her lapel. The bio was a litany of accomplishments that made his own 3 years on the force feel like a joke. A decorated career in federal law enforcement, a master's degree in public administration, and then, the detail that made his stomach curdle into a knot of pure dread, a Ph.D. in behavioral science from Stanford University. He clicked another link, then another. He found articles she had authored in prestigious security journals, dense, academic texts with titles like Mitigating Cognitive Bias in Threat Assessment and De-escalation Protocols for High-Stress Environments. He found photos of her briefing congressional committees, standing at a podium with a confidence that was absolute, her audience of powerful men and women hanging on her every word. He found a video of her giving a keynote address at an international security conference, where she spoke eloquently and passionately about the need for a more intelligent, more humane approach to law enforcement. They hadn't just arrested a boss, they had arrested a titan in their field. They had arrested the architect of the very system they were supposed to be a part of. They had handcuffed the woman who literally wrote the modern playbook on counter-terrorism and security screening, the very person whose theories he had studied, albeit superficially, at the academy. The irony was so thick, so suffocating, he felt like he was choking on it. He pushed back from his desk, a wave of nausea washing over him. He was angry, a hot, bitter anger directed at O'Malley and his old-school, cynical worldview. He had let the veteran officer's jaded pronouncements become his own gospel. But beneath the anger was a deeper, more corrosive shame. He was angrier at himself. He was young, educated, part of a generation that was supposed to be better, more enlightened. Yet, at the first test, he had folded. He had followed O'Malley's lead without question, eager for the older man's approval, desperate to prove he was tough enough. He had traded his own judgment for a pat on the back from a man he didn't even truly respect. His ambition, the driving force of his life, had curdled into a sickening dread. He had wanted to be a leader, a detective, maybe even a supervisor one day. Now, he would be lucky if he was still employed by the end of the week. He stared at his own pale, sweaty reflection in the dark screen of the laptop, and he saw not a promising young officer, but a coward and a fool. High above the glittering tarmac, in a spacious, minimalist office that seemed to float among the city lights, Dr. Maya Daniels was having a very different kind of night. The vast floor-to-ceiling window offered a panoramic view of the airport she commanded, a sprawling kingdom of concrete and light, of arrivals and departures. But she wasn't looking at the view. Her attention was fixed on the large, high-resolution monitor on her desk. On it, a dozen different videos played simultaneously in a silent, repeating loop. It was her arrest, captured from every conceivable angle. There was the official, high-definition feed from the airport security cameras. There were the shaky, vertical videos from a dozen different cell phones, each one offering a slightly different, slightly more personal perspective on her humiliation. She watched them all with a cool, clinical detachment, her face unreadable. She watched as O'Malley and Peterson approached her, their body language a textbook example of aggressive posturing. She watched herself respond, her own posture open and non-confrontational. She watched the moment the cuffs were produced, the way the crowd reacted, the flashes of the cameras. This detached analysis was a mask, a professional shield for a deep, weary anger that simmered beneath the surface. This wasn't just about O'Malley and Peterson. They were not the disease. They were a symptom of the systemic rot she had dedicated her entire career to fighting. The incident was a perfect, painful microcosm of a struggle she knew intimately. A brief, vivid memory flashed in her mind, as sharp and clear as the videos on her screen. She was at Quantico, younger, fiercely ambitious, top of her class. A senior instructor, a man with a weathered face and kind eyes, had taken her aside. "You're brilliant, Daniels," he had said, his voice low. "But you need to understand something. In this world, for people who look like you, you'll have to work twice as hard to be seen as half as good." The memory didn't sting with bitterness anymore. It had been absorbed into her DNA, forged into a core of unyielding resolve. She minimized the videos and pulled up 2 more files on her screen. They were the complete service records for Officer John O'Malley and Officer Ben Peterson. She read through them slowly, methodically. O'Malley's file was thick with commendations for bravery from his early years, but the last decade was a sparse landscape of minor infractions and citizen complaints about his attitude, all of them dismissed. Peterson's file was thinner, filled with glowing performance reviews and notes about his ambition and potential. She saw the whole story laid out before her in black and white. The jaded veteran and the eager follower. Firing them was the easy answer. It would be a clean, decisive action. It would make headlines, generate a few days of positive press about her zero-tolerance policy. Everyone would cheer, and then, in a week, they would forget. But the problem, the rot, would still be there. Firing them would solve nothing. It would just create 2 more resentful, unemployed men, their biases now hardened by a sense of victimhood. It wouldn't teach anyone anything. Her resolve hardened into something sharp and clear, like a diamond. This was not a moment for punishment. This was a moment for education. This would not be a termination. It would be a reconstruction. She turned to a blank document on her screen, the cursor blinking expectantly. She began to type, her fingers moving with a quick, decisive rhythm. She was not outlining a disciplinary action. She was designing a curriculum. This incident, her own public humiliation, would not be a source of shame. It would be a tool. It would be the first, and most important, lesson in a new kind of training. She would not break these men. She would rebuild them. And in doing so, she would begin to rebuild the system from the inside out. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. It was not a smile of humor, but of grim, determined satisfaction. The long night was just beginning, but for the first time, she saw a clear path through the darkness. The walk to the executive suite felt like a mile-long trek across enemy territory. The plush, dark blue carpet seemed to actively suck the sound from the air, swallowing the heavy, rhythmic clomp of their standard-issue boots and leaving an unnerving silence in its wake. John O'Malley and Ben Peterson moved through the hushed corridors, their uniforms, which felt like armor in the bustling public concourses, now feeling like garish, ill-fitting costumes. Here, in the quiet, climate-controlled heart of the airport's command structure, their authority was meaningless. Administrative staff in crisp shirts and tailored slacks glided past, their faces polite masks of professional indifference, but their eyes held a flicker of knowing curiosity. News, especially bad news, traveled at the speed of light in a closed system like this. O'Malley felt 100 pairs of eyes on his back, each one a tiny pinprick to his already shredded pride. He kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, his jaw set so tight it ached. Beside him, Peterson looked like a ghost, his face pale and drawn, his eyes darting around as if seeking an escape route that didn't exist. They were two soldiers being marched to their court-martial, and the silence was their condemnation. A severe-looking woman with a headset and a clipboard met them at the end of the hall. She didn't smile. "The director will see you now," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. She turned and led them to a set of large, unmarked wooden doors, pushing one open and gesturing for them to enter. She didn't follow them in. The door clicked shut behind them, the sound as final as a cell door locking. The office was not what they had expected. It wasn't ostentatious or dripping with the symbols of power they might have imagined. There was no massive, imposing desk to create a barrier. Instead, the room was a testament to quiet, intellectual authority. One entire wall was a floor-to-ceiling window, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the runways. Jets, looking like silver toys from this height, taxied, took off, and landed in a complex, silent ballet. It was a view of a kingdom, seen from the throne. Another wall was filled, not with awards or plaques, but with books. Hundreds of them, their spines forming a mosaic of serious academic titles. Even from the doorway, O'Malley could make out a few. Asterisk thinking, fast and slow, asterisk, asterisk, the psychology of intelligence, analysis, asterisk, asterisk, blind spot, hidden biases of good people, asterisk. The titles were a quiet, powerful declaration of the kind of mind they were about to face. And Dr. Maya Daniels was not behind a desk. The large, elegant desk in the corner was empty, a mere piece of furniture. She sat in one of 3 plush but firm armchairs arranged in the center of the room, a low table between them. She was dressed in a simple, dark blue pantsuit, her posture relaxed but poised. She gestured with an open hand toward the other 2 chairs. The message was unmistakable and deeply unsettling. This was not going to be a formal dressing down, a sentencing from on high. This was to be a conversation, and that was infinitely more terrifying. They walked across the room, their footsteps now seeming thunderous on the polished hardwood floor that bordered the central rug. They sat, the leather of the chairs sighing under their weight. The air was thick with a tension so profound it felt hard to breathe. For a full minute, Maya said nothing. She simply looked at them, her gaze moving from O'Malley's tense, florid face to Peterson's pale, downcast one. It wasn't an angry look. It was analytical, curious, like a scientist observing a specimen. Finally, she spoke, her voice as even and devoid of anger as it had been in the concourse. "Good morning. Let's not waste time. I don't want apologies. I want an explanation." She leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped loosely in her lap. "Officer O'Malley, as the senior officer on the scene, you can begin. Walk me through your threat assessment process from the moment you first saw me." O'Malley cleared his throat, his mouth suddenly as dry as sand. He tried to fall back on the familiar scaffolding of his training, the jargon that had protected him for years. The subject, "You were observed loitering near a sterile area," he began, his voice raspy and uncertain, exhibiting behavior inconsistent with a typical passenger. "You were stationary for an extended period. Your posture suggested you were attempting to conceal your purpose." Maya held up a hand, a simple, elegant gesture that stopped him mid-sentence. "Let's be precise, officer," she said, her tone still conversational. "You used the word loitering. The TSA Field Operations Manual, which I assume you've read, defines loitering in Section 4. Paragraph 2, as remaining in an area without a discernible legitimate purpose, in a manner that suggests intent to disrupt or observe security procedures for illicit reasons. The key word there is intent. What specific actions demonstrated my intent?" As she spoke, she picked up a small remote from the table and the large monitor on the wall, previously disguised as a piece of modern art, flickered to life. It showed a crystal-clear, high-angle view of the checkpoint from yesterday morning. She paused the video on a frame showing her standing by the pillar. "You also said I was watching," she continued, her eyes flicking from the screen to O'Malley's face. "As you can see from this angle, and we've used biometric tracking to confirm it, my eye line was consistently directed at the X-ray conveyor belt and the baggage screening process. My focus was on the efficiency of the bag screening, not the agents themselves. That is a key distinction, wouldn't you agree? One is quality control. The other is casing a joint." O'Malley stared at the screen. He saw himself and Peterson approaching, their strides long and aggressive. He saw Maya turn, her body language open, her hands clearly visible. The narrative he had constructed in his mind, the one where he was the vigilant hero, was being systematically dismantled by irrefutable, high-definition proof. He had no answer. He just shook his head slightly, a tiny, involuntary gesture of defeat. Maya's gaze shifted to the younger officer. "Officer Peterson, you stated that I seemed agitated when you approached. Is that correct?" Peterson flinched as if he'd been struck. He looked up, his eyes wide with a kind of pleading terror. "Ma'am, yes, that was my assessment at the time." "An assessment?" Maya repeated softly. "Let's look at the data." She manipulated the remote. The main video continued to play, but now smaller windows opened up around it. One showed a biometric analysis, heart rate and respiration extrapolated from micro-expressions and posture. Maya's line was a steady, calm wave. The lines for O'Malley and Peterson were jagged peaks, climbing steadily. "My hands are unclenched," Maya narrated, her voice a calm counterpoint to the damning evidence on the screen. "My posture is open, a non-confrontational stance." Audio forensics from a nearby camera confirmed that my tone remained within a calm, conversational decibel range, even after you raised your voices. She paused the video again, this time on a close-up of the two officers crowding her. "Your postures, however, are closed, confrontational. You invaded my personal space, closing from a distance of 3 meters to less than 1 in under 4 seconds. Your voices, as the audio analysis shows, increased in both volume and pitch. So, I'll ask you, Officer Peterson, who is escalating this encounter?" Peterson couldn't speak. He stared at the screen, at the undeniable proof of their aggression, of his own misjudgment. The shame was a physical thing, a hot flush that spread from his neck to his face. He had been so sure, so confident in his reading of the situation, a confidence borrowed entirely from his cynical partner. Now, he saw that confidence for what it was, a flimsy shield for a deep, unexamined prejudice. Maya wasn't finished. She was a surgeon, and the operation was far from over. She was cutting away the diseased tissue of their assumptions with the cold, sharp scalpel of pure reason. "The capstone of your justification, Officer O'Malley, was your statement that you were acting for the safety of the other passengers, who you claimed were made nervous by my presence." She clicked the remote again. The videos were replaced by a document, a series of transcribed statements. This, however, is not what the other passengers said. "We have transcribed and signed statements from 5 travelers who were standing within 10 feet of the incident. I took the liberty of having them contacted last night." She read from the screen, her voice clear and steady. "Mr. Gerald Abernathy, a retired schoolteacher from Savannah, stated, and I quote, 'The woman in the hoodie seemed perfectly fine, just watching things, until those 2 officers started harassing her. They were the ones causing a scene.' Miss Wei Lu, a software engineer on her way to a conference in San Francisco, said, 'I became nervous when the officers got aggressive with her. It felt completely unnecessary and, frankly, racially motivated.' Mr. and Mrs. Sharma, traveling with their 2 young children, stated that they moved their family away because, quote, 'the policemen were being bullies, and it was frightening our daughter.'" She let the words hang in the silent office. The hum of the building's ventilation system seemed to grow louder, filling the space left by their shattered defenses. "The disturbance wasn't my presence, officers," Maya said, her voice dropping slightly, losing its clinical edge and taking on a new, heavier weight. "The disturbance was your intervention. You didn't de-escalate a situation. You created one. You didn't react to a threat. You became the threat." O'Malley finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since he'd sat down. The defensiveness was gone, replaced by a raw, naked bewilderment. His entire professional identity, his sense of himself as a protector, a guardian of the peace, had been systematically and logically obliterated in the space of 10 minutes. He saw the incident not through the fog of his own biases, but through the crystal-clear lens of the woman sitting before him, and the image was horrifying. Peterson just stared at his own hands, clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles were white. He felt like a fraud, a child playing dress-up in a uniform he hadn't earned and didn't deserve. The slow, painful dissection of their professional pride was complete. The room was silent, save for the distant, almost imperceptible whine of a jet engine spooling up on the runway far below, a sound of departure, of a journey just beginning. Maya let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of her words to settle into the very bones of the 2 men sitting before her. Then, she rose from her chair in a single, fluid motion. "The theoretical portion of this meeting is over," she announced, her voice regaining its crisp command, like quality. "Come with me." Without waiting for a response, she walked toward a discreet, unmarked door on the far side of her office. O'Malley and Peterson exchanged a brief, terrified glance before scrambling to their feet and following her, their movements clumsy and uncertain. They were like sheep being led, not to the slaughter, but to something far more unnerving, an unknown reckoning. The door opened not into another hallway, but into a small, dark antechamber. As the door closed behind them, the room was plunged into near, total darkness. A soft click echoed, and a section of the far wall slid away with a quiet hiss, revealing a space that seemed to have been pulled from a science fiction film. It was a vast, cavernous, circular room, the walls of which were seamless, floor to ceiling screens. The air was cool and smelled of ozone and new electronics. In the center of the room were 3 minimalist chairs, identical to the ones in her office, facing the wrap around screens. "This is the TSA's advanced training facility," Maya said, her voice echoing slightly in the large space. "Most officers only ever hear about it. You two get the VIP tour." She gestured toward the chairs. "Time for a practical exam." They sat down, their bodies rigid with apprehension. The wall slid shut behind them, sealing them in the darkness. For a moment, there was only the faint hum of powerful computers. Then, the screens flickered to life, and the officers gasped. They were no longer in a dark room. They were standing in a perfect, hyper-realistic replica of the airport's main ticketing lobby. The detail was staggering, from the scuff marks on the floor to the flickering departure board in the distance to the low murmur of a simulated crowd. "You are now Officers Miller and Davis," Maya's voice said, seemingly coming from all around them. "You are on patrol. Your avatars will respond to your verbal commands. Engage." Before them, a simulated character appeared. He was a white man in his late 40s, dressed in a $2,000 tailored suit, a silk tie perfectly knotted at his throat. He clutched a polished leather briefcase to his chest with white, knuckled intensity. Beads of sweat dotted his forehead, trickling down his temples despite the cool, simulated air. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, darted around the lobby, never settling on one spot for more than a second. He was speaking in hushed, urgent tones into his phone, his words clipped and frantic. "The package is secure," he whispered, his back to them. "No one followed me. I'll make the drop at the designated time." "Okay," O'Malley said, his voice shaky as he addressed his virtual self. Let's go talk to him." Their avatars began to walk toward the man. "Approach with a non-confrontational posture," Peterson added quickly, remembering the lesson from minutes before. Their avatars slowed, their hands held loosely at their sides. They stopped a respectful distance from the man in the suit. "Sir, is everything all right?" O'Malley's avatar asked, its voice programmed to be deferential and polite. "You seem a bit stressed. Can we help you with anything?" The man spun around, his eyes wild. "I'm fine, just a stressful day at the office. Leave me alone." Even as his behavior became more erratic, the officers' avatars remained passive, their programming reflecting the operator's own instincts. They offered assistance, asked if he needed medical attention, gave him every possible benefit of the doubt. "Pause simulation," Maya's voice commanded. The scene froze. The man in the suit was locked in a silent scream, his face a mask of panic. "Explain your approach," Maya said, her voice cold. "His behavior is a textbook level 3 threat indicator. Sweating, agitation, paranoid speech, clutching a personal item as if it's a bomb, furtive movements. Your own training manual dictates an immediate assertive engagement and isolation of the subject, yet you approached him like he was a lost tourist." "Why the kid gloves, officers?" O'Malley opened his mouth, but no words came out. The answer was obvious and shameful. The man's suit, his race, his apparent wealth, had acted as a shield, deflecting their suspicion before it could even fully form. "Reset simulation," Maya commanded. The lobby dissolved, then reformed. The man in the suit was gone. In his place stood a young black man, no older than 19. He wore a hoodie, the hood down, and large, expensive-looking headphones over his ears. He was bobbing his head to a silent beat, a backpack slung casually over one shoulder. He looked around, his brow furrowed in confusion, turning in a slow circle as if trying to get his bearings. He was clearly, unambiguously lost. "Engage," Maya said. The reaction was instantaneous, a gut-level response that bypassed conscious thought. "Hey, you," O'Malley barked, his voice sharp and accusatory. "What are you doing here?" Their avatars surged forward, their virtual bodies tense, their hands automatically moving to rest on the butts of their service weapons. They closed the distance aggressively, flanking the young man before he even had a chance to register their presence. He pulled off his headphones, his eyes wide with surprise and fear. I was just looking for Gate B-42, he stammered. "Freeze frame," Maya's voice cut through the air like a shard of ice. The scene froze, a perfect tableau of their bias. The two large, imposing officers looming over the scared, confused teenager. "Look at the screen," Maya ordered, her voice low and dangerous. "Look at your posture. Confrontational, accusatory. Your hands are on your weapons. For a boy who is lost." She let the silence hang for a moment. The image on the screen, a brutal indictment. You saw a hoodie and a skin color, and your brains filled in the rest of the story with a narrative of crime and danger. The man in the suit, who was a genuine risk according to your own protocols, got your respect and your deference. The boy who needed help got your aggression and your suspicion. Explain the difference. The two men were silent, the lesson hitting home not as an intellectual concept, but as a visceral, sickening lurch in the pit of their stomachs. They were seeing their own prejudice played out in front of them, stripped bare of all justification and rationalization. It was ugly, and it was undeniable. The simulation faded, and the room returned to a neutral gray. Maya allowed the silence to stretch, to let the full weight of the lesson sink in. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted. The cold, clinical instructor was gone, replaced by something firmer, but with a new, raw edge of empathy. "This isn't just a training exercise," she said, her voice quiet but resonant in the large room. "This isn't about avatars and scenarios. This is about people." She took a deep breath, and for the first time, a flicker of personal pain crossed her features. "Last year, my own son, a 17-year-old honor student with a 4.2 GPA, was followed by security in a department store for 20 minutes. He was trying to buy me a birthday present with the money he'd earned from his summer job." Her voice was steady, but a deep, maternal anger pulsed just beneath the surface. They saw a tall black kid in a nice jacket looking at expensive watches, and their brains wrote a script. The script said he was there to steal. They stopped him at the door, made him empty his pockets in front of everyone. He had over $800 in cash in his wallet. He was humiliated. He was so ashamed. He didn't want to go to the mall for 6 months afterward. He asked me, "Mom, what did I do wrong?" She paused, her gaze locking onto O'Malley's, then Peterson's. "He did nothing wrong. The security guards did nothing wrong, according to their flawed, biased script. But they left a scar on my son. That is the human cost of the script you're following. It's not just about missing a flight. It's about the 1,000 tiny cuts that bleed a person's dignity away, drop by drop." The story landed with the force of a physical blow. It transformed the abstract concept of bias into a concrete, painful reality. It was no longer about protocols and procedures. It was about a 17-year-old boy who was afraid to go to the mall. It was about a mother, a powerful, brilliant woman, who had been helpless to protect her child from the very prejudice she fought every day. And that's when the first crack appeared in John O'Malley's hardened facade. The defensiveness that had been his armor for 25 years finally shattered. He slumped in his chair, the air seeming to rush out of him, leaving him deflated and old. He stared at the blank gray screen, but he was seeing something else entirely, a memory he had buried for over a decade. "There was a family," he said, his voice quiet and raspy, barely a whisper. "Years ago, a Latino family. Mom, Dad, 3 little kids. They were running to their gate, shouting to each other in Spanish. My partner and I, we stopped them. My gut told me something was off. They were agitated, frantic." He shook his head slowly, a look of profound disgust on his face. "We held them, questioned them, searched their bags, found nothing. By the time we let them go, they had missed their flight." He finally looked up, his eyes swimming with a shame he had refused to acknowledge for years. "The father," he looked at me, and he said, in perfect English, "We were going to my mother's funeral. I told him we were just doing our job. I buried it. I never filed a full report on the stop." He took a ragged breath. "A funeral. I made them miss a funeral because of my gut." Beside him, Ben Peterson didn't speak. He couldn't. He just stared at the floor, the shame radiating from him in palpable waves. He saw his own reflection in O'Malley's story, the same lazy assumptions, the same casual cruelty disguised as procedure. The high-tech, sterile environment of the simulation room had become a confessional, a place where the raw, uncomfortable truths they had hidden even from themselves were finally being exposed to the light. The turning point had been reached, not through disciplinary action or intellectual debate, but through a shared, painful recognition of their own fallibility. They returned to Maya's office in a heavy, suffocating silence. The simulation room had stripped them bare, leaving their professional identities in tatters on its cold, sterile floor. They sat back down in the armchairs, which now felt less like seats of conversation and more like the witness stand. Outside the immense window, the sun was beginning its final descent, painting the western sky in fiery strokes of orange, purple, and gold. The light, beautiful and serene, felt like a mockery. It streamed into the office, casting long, accusatory shadows that stretched across the floor like grasping fingers. The two officers were mentally and emotionally exhausted, hollowed out by the brutal self-examination they had been forced to endure. They sat in the fading light, two broken men, awaiting their fate. Maya let the silence linger for another long moment before she spoke, her voice soft but carrying the weight of a final judgment. "I've spent the last several hours reviewing your complete service records, referencing them with your performance in the simulation, and weighing that against what I saw today." She paused, her gaze moving from one man to the other. "Firing you would be the easy path. It would be clean. It would make headlines, and my superiors would applaud the decisive action. The media would have a field day. Everyone would feel a sense of righteous justice for about a week, and then the world would move on." She leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees, her expression one of intense, piercing seriousness. "But the problem would still exist. The bias that led you to arrest me wouldn't vanish just because you lost your jobs. It would curdle into resentment. You would become martyrs in some circles, victims of political correctness, and the next pair of officers with the same unexamined assumptions would just take your place. Nothing would actually change." She let that sink in before delivering her verdict. "You two are now uniquely qualified. You have failed in a way that few officers ever will, and you have been forced to confront the anatomy of that failure in excruciating detail. You are the living embodiment of a systemic failure, and that makes you an invaluable resource." The officers looked up, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning disbelief. "So, here is my decision," Maya continued, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "You're not fired. You're being reassigned. Effective Monday morning, you both will be heading a new, mandatory peer-to-peer training initiative. The program will focus on implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and the human cost of procedural errors. Your first case study, the one you will build the entire curriculum around, will be your own, anonymized, of course. You're going to take what you learned in this office, in that simulation room, and you are going to teach it to every single officer in this region. You are going to make sure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else in this airport again." The officers were stunned into absolute silence. This was not a punishment they could have ever imagined. It was not a suspension, not a demotion, not a termination. It was a responsibility, a burden of such immense weight that it seemed impossible. It was a form of penance that was both a condemnation and, strangely, an act of profound faith in them. O'Malley, the hardened cynic who had just confessed to a decade-old sin, was the first to find his voice. He looked up, and for the first time since she had met him, his eyes were clear. The fog of bitterness and prejudice burned away by the harsh light of self-awareness. "Director," he began, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't quite place, a mixture of shame and overwhelming gratitude. I don't know what to say." He took a long, shuddering breath. "It's more than I deserve." "Much more." He met her gaze directly, and she saw in his eyes not the broken man of a few moments ago, but the first flicker of a new, unfamiliar fire. "I'll do it," he said, his voice gaining a strength she hadn't heard before. "I'll make it the most important work I do before I retire. I swear." Beside him, Ben Peterson, who had been staring at his hands as if they were alien things, finally looked up. His face was streaked with tears. He hadn't even seemed to notice he was crying. The intellectual shame had given way to a raw, powerful wave of emotion. He was not just a fool who had made a mistake. He was a man being given a chance to atone for it in the most meaningful way possible. "Thank you, Director," he whispered, his voice choked and hoarse. He had to stop and clear his throat before he could continue. "Thank you." He nodded, a series of short, sharp movements, as if trying to convince himself that this was real. "I won't let you down. I promise you, I will not let you down." Days later, the atmosphere in the airport's main press briefing room was electric. The story of the TSA director's arrest had been simmering online, a cocktail of shaky cell phone videos, eyewitness accounts, and rampant speculation. It had all the ingredients of a viral scandal: race, power, and a dramatic confrontation. The room was packed with reporters from local news affiliates and national outlets, their cameras forming a dense forest of lenses, all pointed at the empty podium. A palpable sense of anticipation hung in the air, the hungry buzz of a media pack sensing blood in the water. They were expecting a spectacle, a public flogging, a dramatic announcement of termination. Then, Dr. Maya Daniels stepped to the podium. She was the picture of poise and control, dressed in a dark, authoritative suit, her demeanor calm and unflappable. She moved with a quiet confidence that immediately commanded the room's attention, the low murmur of conversation dying down as she adjusted the microphone. She didn't deflect or minimize. She didn't hide behind jargon or corporate doublespeak. She owned the narrative from the very first word. She looked directly into the sea of cameras, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear and resonant. "I've called this press conference to address a recent incident at this airport which has, understandably, garnered significant public attention." She paused, letting the room settle into complete silence. This incident provided a valuable, if difficult, learning opportunity. It highlighted a failure, not of individuals, but of our systems and our training. It showed us that there can be a profound gap between our stated principles and our practiced reality. She continued, her words carefully chosen, each one landing with deliberate force. "Let me be clear. Security and dignity are not mutually exclusive concepts. They are, and must be, intertwined. The mission of the TSA is to protect our nation's transportation systems, but we must do so in a way that respects the rights and humanity of every single person who passes through our gates. When we fail in that, we fail in our mission." The reporters scribbled furiously, their initial hunger for scandal being replaced by the realization that they were witnessing a masterclass in leadership. "That is why I am announcing today the immediate implementation of a new, mandatory training program for all security and law enforcement personnel in this region. This program, which will be developed and led by veteran officers, will be focused on advanced de-escalation techniques and, most critically, on identifying and mitigating the role of implicit bias in threat assessment." She never mentioned O'Malley or Peterson by name. She never offered the salacious details the media craved. She elevated the entire conversation from one of gossip and blame to one of policy and progress. "We can, and we will, do better," she concluded, her voice ringing with conviction. "This incident will not be a headline that is forgotten tomorrow. It will be the catalyst for meaningful, lasting change." A month later, Maya was walking through the main concourse. This time, she was not in a hoodie, but in her work attire, moving with the quiet authority of the director. The airport hummed around her, a symphony of rolling suitcases, final boarding calls, and joyful reunions. It was her kingdom, and she was observing it not with the critical eye of a spot check, but with a sense of cautious optimism. As she passed a crowded gate, she saw a small boy, no older than 5, crying, clearly separated from his parents. Before an airport ambassador could even respond, she saw an officer approach the child. It was Ben Peterson. He knelt down, bringing himself to the boy's eye level, his posture open and gentle. The aggressive confrontational officer from the simulation room was gone, replaced by a man who radiated patience and kindness. "Hey there, little man," she heard him say, his voice soft. "Lost your flight crew? Let's find them together." He spoke to the child with a calming reassurance that soothed the boy's tears, eventually locating his frantic parents and reuniting them with a warm smile. Maya continued her walk, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. A little further on, she glanced through the large glass window of a training classroom. Inside, a group of new recruits in crisp, new uniforms sat listening intently. Standing before them, gesturing passionately as he pointed to a complex diagram on a screen, was John O'Malley. He was in his element, but it was a new element, one he had discovered in the ashes of his old self. The jaded cynicism that had defined him for years was gone, replaced by a fervent, almost evangelical sense of purpose. He was not just teaching, he was testifying. He was using the anonymous story of his own greatest failure to arm a new generation of officers against the very biases that had been his undoing. Maya watched for a moment longer, a quiet sense of profound satisfaction settling over her. She had taken a moment of personal humiliation and transformed it into a force for institutional change. She had chosen reconstruction over retribution, and the fruits of that decision were right here before her eyes. She turned and continued her walk, her footsteps sure and steady on the polished floor of the airport she was changing. One officer, one interaction, one lesson at a time, from the inside out.